Of a new book on South Africa's political landscape believes the country's future is bright despite concerns around the quality of political leadership. John Campbell served as a political counselor at the American Embassy in Pretoria in the early to mid-1990s and later as a United States ambassador to Nigeria, and is currently the Ralph Bunche Senior Fellow for Africa Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. Ambassador Campbell sat down with our very own Sherwin Bryce-Pease to talk about his new book, Morning in South Africa, that covers the trajectory of the country, its relationship with the United States, and his critique of some of the figures who dominate the country's political discourse today.
Ambassador John Campbell, good to see you. Thanks very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for having me.
Why did you feel it was necessary to write this book? Obviously, it was written for a foreign audience, but what was the objective?
Well, I was intrigued with how much or how little South Africa has changed since 1994. I was also concerned that Americans who had been very much focused on South Africa during the period of the transition, that for too many of us it had just sort of dropped off the radar. Instead of being the Rainbow Nation, a grand democratic experiment, the construction of a country based on democracy, human rights, and multiracial. Instead, too many Americans were looking at South Africa from the perspective of game parks. Now, game parks are fine, but it's of limited relevance to the greater world. Whereas I think South Africa is of great relevance to the great world, as it were, because, as I argue there, it is an experiment in non-racial democracy, but it's an experiment that's actually working.
But it begs the question then, why did it fall off the radar so far in terms of the American public?
I think there are a variety of answers to that. First of all, the attention span of my fellow countrymen with respect to the outside world is not exactly elephantine. It's more like a squirrel. So you start with that. Secondly, there are relatively few areas of security concern where our interests overlap. Mm-hmm. And then, ironically, South Africa's very success. There's no Darfur, there's no Ebola, there's no civil war. There is none of the kinds of events that generate American attention. HIV/AIDS, yes, but HIV/AIDS is a pandemic. It's not just in South Africa.
And Ronald Reagan and his veto in the 80s frayed the relationship and has in many ways defined the relationship that the ANC government has had with Washington to date, not so?
I would agree with that. I would agree that historical memory plays an extremely important role. I would say that the memory is distorted. It is forgotten that Ronald Reagan's veto was overturned by the Congress, one of the very, very few times that has ever happened. It's also forgotten that Ronald Reagan appointed the first African-American ambassador to South Africa. In other words, the evolution of the Reagan administration, and it did evolve, it did change, is I think too often overlooked in South Africa.
And yet the relationship, as much as they have these strategic dialogues, it's nothing more than cordial. These are not great friends anymore. Is that surprising to Americans?
Well, or at least, I don't know about to Americans, it's disappointing to me, because it does seem to me that two democratic multiracial countries have a great deal in common. Certainly, there is a great deal that we Americans could learn from the South African experience. And to me, it is disappointing the relationship is not very much closer. In 1994, there was a kind of American expectation that the relationship would indeed be very close, that possibly something like the bilateral relationship with Australia or New Zealand, a relationship where there would be almost constant consultation. Those expectations were disappointed fairly early on. I think the Mandela administration was disappointed at the relatively low levels of American economic investment in South Africa, perhaps overlooking the fact that American investment decisions are made by private corporations and largely without reference to the federal government. For the Americans, there was disappointment that the Mandela administration pursued its close relationship with Gaddafi, and subsequently that Mbeki seemed to look the other way with respect to the gross human rights violations in Zimbabwe. So on both sides, I think there was some disappointment.
Let's talk a bit more about specifics in the book and your broad analysis of the political landscape in South Africa today. I mean, you write about the style of the government that has become more African
Yes.
and less Western since the days of Nelson Mandela.
Style.
Is that supposed to be a bad thing?
No,
I mean,
by
why
no means.
why make that comparison?
No, by no means is it a bad thing. And in fact, in the book, I point out that, in fact, in the 21 or 22 years since the transition, the majority of the population of South Africa is now at home in their own country in a way they were not before 1994. And the style of governance, including things like wholesale renaming of places, I think contributes to that.
You also write, Ambassador, about what you call a dysfunctional leadership at the top, and that in your analysis, perhaps, it's made less so by a strong independent judicial system, a strong vocal civil society, a largely market-driven economy that leads you to a generally positive assessment of this country. Speak to that.
That's correct. All democracies can have patches of bad governance. Think in terms of our own history of Richard Nixon, or it could happen in the future, where the American political system may face an episode of poor governance.
Can't imagine what you're talking about.
I'm sure you can't. In the American case, and in the South African case now, the institutions, Constitution, internalizing the rule of law, those Chapter 9 institutions which protect South Africans. Mm-hmm. I would even say even more basic is the fact that South Africa is a constitutional democracy. It is not a parliamentary democracy.
Correct.
That means there are limits imposed by the law on what any government can do at any level. This means that as an entity, mm-hmm. South Africa is pretty tough. And in that sense, I think there are distinct similarities to the United States and to other advanced democracies around the world.
Well, having said that, you still raise concerns about corruption and cronyism. And you raised the concerns about the big style of government built around a strongman personality, yes, a la Zimbabwe, a la Uganda.
South Africans worry about that too.
What do you make about the prospects for that happening in South Africa?
I don't first of all, obviously, anything can happen. It's impossible to predict the future. I think it is highly unlikely. I think the institutions are so strong that big man governance is not really an option. And in fact, we've had some pretty clear proof of that in recent court decisions and in the performance of the public protector.
And yet political leadership, you write about, is important. You know, you write about the darkest cloud in South Africa's morning sky is the quality of the political leadership at the top, and that's not going to make you many friends in the ANC.
Probably not. What's the problem here? The problem is, if there is an administration that is widely perceived as corrupt, infected by cronyism, it becomes very difficult for that administration to actually address the real issues that the country faces. It becomes
Hypocrisy.
hypocrisy, but it also consumes energy. So that the kind of political infighting that we are seeing now means there is less attention, there's less energy that can be devoted to issues like meaningful educational reform. I tend to think that that education is central to bringing down the unemployment rate, which is central to reducing levels of poverty. But that's not what the upper reaches of the ANC seem to be concerned about now. It's much more retail politics, if you like.
And then you have the economic freedom fighters, you have the Democratic Alliance. What's your sense when we are going into an election in August, municipal elections, local government elections? I'm sure you've seen the scenes in Parliament. What do you make about this Malema-led EFF and the Maimane-led Democratic Alliance?
Well, here's my problem with the EFF. It's not its ideas. The EFF is the closest thing South Africa has to a left-wing political party, and it's not very left-wing. What I think is distressing about the EFF is its willingness to resort to anti-parliamentary tactics, demonstrations on the floor of the House, preventing people from speaking. This does not promote a democratic culture.
What does it promote?
It promotes, I'm afraid, a kind of contempt for political institutions in general. Democratic Alliance, very interesting. Its leadership is impressive. The question, I think, will be whether it can break out of the particular electoral ghetto that it's in. I mean, its electoral support is overwhelmingly white, colored, and Asian. 80% of South Africa's population is black. If it is ever going to be a party of governance, it has to make itself relevant to the majority of the population. It will be interesting to watch the local government elections coming up to see whether, in fact, it is able to attract significant numbers of black voters.
We haven't spoken very glowingly about the ANC's leadership, but is there impressive leadership within the ANC?
Yes. I think one of the interesting things about the ANC is it's a very, very broad tent. One way to think about it is there's an important part of the ANC that is genuinely democratic and genuinely espouses non-racial ideals. It's right there. It's alive and kicking. Then there is the sort of personalities in the ANC who have, in my view a lot of other people too, have lost sight of the ANC's ideals and are too concerned about exercising power for its own sake and also their own economic advancement. ANC's big. It's big and it's variable. It is not monolithic, and I think it certainly has within itself the seeds of reform.
Final question. You do explain it in the book, but could you explain for our viewers, Mourning in South Africa, the title of this book?
The title of the book deliberately echoes Ronald Reagan's campaign for his second term. His campaign slogan was, "It's Morning in America." Only, of course, if you were an anti-apartheid activist, if you were trying to address America's civil rights issues, if you were concerned about gross inequality of income, it wasn't Morning in America. But Reagan caught something, and that is, after one difficult event after another, all during the 1970s, by his second term, things were looking up. Americans were becoming optimistic. in general. I think there's something of that in South Africa now. Again, it's very striking how you can almost watch the mood in South Africa changing in the aftermath of the public protector, the court decisions, the apparent resolution of Nkandla and other such. So it's morning. It's not dawn. I mean, it's...
So the sun's going up.
Yeah, sun's going up. Exactly. Just as it is here.
John Campbell, Ambassador, thank you so much.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you much.